The topic for panel 1 is Reconsidering the Strategic Landscape, which will follow nicely on from Dr. Wilson's opening comments. Moderating the panel is Dr. Dave Oakley from JSOU. Dr. Oakley is the ideal first moderator. He's a retired artillery strategist officer, unlike Dr. Wilson, who has 6 master's degrees, Dr. Oakley only has a PhD and 3 master's degrees. But there's still time, Dr. Oakley. Dr. Oakley has had tours at the Central Intelligence Agency and at the Center for, the CTC, the National Counterterrorism Center, and I think I will leave it there. His PhD, by the way, is from Kansas State University. He is going to introduce the panelists, which include Dr. Yuval Weber from the Krulak Center at the Marine Corps University, Dr. Dave Dudas from Joint Special Operations University, and my good friend Bob Jones from the USSOCOM Plans and Directorate J5. So, Dr. Oakley, the floor is yours, sir.
Hey, thank you, General Howard, for the introduction. And I surrender. I'm going to let Dr. Wilson have the victory on the number of master's degrees. Today, I'd like to thank you, General Howard, Dr. Wilson, and the forum organizers for giving me this fantastic opportunity and privilege of moderating the first panel, a panel full of great scholar practitioners. So individuals from both academia, with academic experience, and with also practitioner experience in educating practitioners. As General Howard mentioned, our overall panel theme is Reconsidering the Strategic Landscape. I won't go into detail on the bios of the 3 panelists. You can look in the forum program. They're too long to read and to capture the richness of their experience. What we'll do is we'll give each panelist 10 minutes to present their talking points, their themes. We will then open up the last 45 minutes for discussion. And so begin today with Dr. Yuval Weber from the Krulak Center, whose presentation theme is Historical Cases of Strategic Competition, History Redux. Dr. Weber, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much to JSOU, to Dr. Oakley, to Dr. Marsh, and all the rest of the organizers. I appreciate the invitation greatly. Just one question, will there be a slideshow that accompanies this, or shall So I can also share my screen in just a second. I have the slides that I sent ahead, but where I'd like to actually begin for just a moment is the comments by Dr. Wilson a moment ago. And in that, what Dr. Wilson was talking about was the interwar period turned out to be an aberration, as it were. That it was, thinking back about the Great War, the war to end all wars, people, strategists, politicians, the general population was fairly surprised that World War II happened to follow World War I because they thought there was no such thing as World War II available. So where I want to frame my comments today and to think about basically this current iteration, and it is an iteration of great power competition, is to make a very similar comment. The 1990s as a period of untrammeled US power, acknowledged US unipolarity, that is over. The weakened position of Russia in the post-Soviet collapse, that is no longer. Although Russia is not what the Soviet Union was and will not be what the Soviet Union was, it certainly isn't the basket case that it was. And China has emerged from its pariah status after the Tiananmen Square massacre. It's no longer that particular state. It has come into the international economy. Whether or not it's been quote unquote properly socialized, that's going to be I think the topic of conversation for the next 2 days. But what we can think about is that period is over. And so in thinking about that, we can also then say the global war on terror as the defining idea of what is U.S. national security and what is the thing that organized the U.S. national security state, it's over. But I also wanted to do, and over the next couple slides, is to then define what it is that great power competition actually is. And here's basically the big pitch. In order to think about how to frame great power competition and how to frame what is the role of special forces going forward. And I'll talk about the U.S. strategy documents in a second. We don't have a really clear definition of what is great power competition. And the thing that I'll offer to all of you is it's actually three different things happening at once. That at the end of a great power war, and the Cold War is the last one that we fought, there are basically several great powers that emerge in which they organized the rules of the game for the international order. And that essentially is what defines one component of great power competition. It is the great power confrontation among great powers who are preparing for basically World War III. It's that confrontation among states that have independent foreign policies, United States, Russia, China today, that defines one leg of this triad. The second one, and here's where I'll talk about historical cases, including the Cold War, is that it's about alliance management. It's about creating hierarchies of order. It's about creating these alliance networks in order to help prepare and deter other great power rivals. And the third thing is what is happening inside the domestic politics of the great powers. Part of the transition from global war on terror to great power competition is that the US population is a little bit tired of Afghanistan, of Iraq, and all the things that come with that. So what is the thing that can motivate the US population to say, this generational systemic struggle against China, all the issues that we face with Russia, is a good use of our energy, our money, and potentially the blood of the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And so thinking about those three things all together at one time, that's essentially what creates international politics. And that's what creates the potential to engage in conflict or not. So let's go to the first slide. So in that, we see, what global war on terror. And this brief is available to anyone who asks. My email address is just yuvalweber@gmail.com. When we see here, we see from President Obama, from President Trump, from President Biden, all three of these presidents had security documents in which they described the fear of losing ground to authoritarian influence, malign state actors, and shifting the official strategy away from counterinsurgency, irregular warfare, and global war on terror as organizing principles. From Obama's national military strategy in February 2015 through President Biden's interim national security strategic guidance, they all roughly say the same thing without exactly defining what is great power competition in anything other than it's basically everything in international politics. So next slide, please. So in that, we can see that great power competition is comprised of three interconnected processes. It is the great power confrontation, and you can see the pictures on the top right there. It's President Xi, taking a selfie with President Putin, while Putin is holding a tricolored oil barrel. Russia and China balancing the United States. So that's part of the great power competition that we're all very, very familiar with. But it's also alliance management, as I said. And so in the bottom, we would have been really comfortable with this idea that these things happen at the same time if we'd been thinking about this in a Cold War context. If we were having this Zoom, which obviously didn't exist, in 1948, we would have been looking at pictures such as that in the bottom left, which is an advertisement for an early poster for NATO, which is whatever the weather, we must move together. And US policymakers at that time would have thought the Marshall Plan, NATO, all the other aspects of creating bonds between the United States and allied states, not just from the military to military level or government to government level, but on a population to population level, that's what it would have also, that would have been very familiar. And particularly for the US population, the defense of Europe would have just been a natural thing to think about. After 2 wars, let's avoid the third one. But at the same time, the Soviet Union, it was doing its same thing. So that middle one, some of you may speak Russian or can read Cyrillic, that is the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, which is basically the Marshall Plan counterpart from the Soviet Union. And what we see there on the right is One Belt, One Road. So in this, all, 2 great powers, in the Cold War, 3 great powers now are not only preparing for conflict against each other, but are also thinking, how can we expand our alliance network in order to better deter our rivals? And then the third aspect of what is great power competition is the social contract within the great powers. Why should the US people care about this? Why should the US people accept, a defense budget, which is $750 billion? What is the ultimate purpose? And so that's where we start to see a lot of the trying to figure out, these underlying issues. Our policy questions conflate these different issues and lead, I would believe, to a lot of sort of wasted energy, because we conflate great power confrontation with alliance management and ignore US domestic politics. When we ask questions such as, is America winning or losing? Is OBOR a threat to US interests? Are Russian PMCs operating sub-Saharan Africa dangerous? What do the people care about these issues? If we don't sort of identify what is the specific question and what is the specific process, we may waste time, energy, money, and ultimately ground to our great power rivals. So next slide, please. And so where I would like to conclude, because I'm not exactly sure on time here, is we need to disaggregate strategic questions into the correct component. What is a question related to preparation for conflict against another great power? How do we provide a more attractive basis for alliance and partnership with third-party states? And how do we evaluate the ask upon the US public and increasing domestic costs in other great powers? And that's a lot, when we then sort of turn towards, special forces. If the great power conflict, thinking at that top layer of structural politics, we think, this is what the nuclear weapons are for. This is what the aircraft carriers are for. This is what the really big, collections of soldiers are for. That's one thing. But it's also when we then think, what are the elements that special forces can provide on the margin of increasing, beyond, the top level stuff? How can special forces increase the capacity of partners? Not just in the literal sense of how can they add a bit more and this, that, and the other, but also how can special forces act as a signal to other states that in addition to whatever sort of overt political confrontation that you're engaged with, in terms of articulating your resilience, your autonomy vis-a-vis Russia or China, how can we, in terms of the United States, use special forces to say you can be a little bit more proactive in your defense, because the United States, not only at the level of overt military to military cooperation or in terms of overt diplomatic support, but here's all the things that we can do in order to buck up your bargaining positions when it comes to the pressure that you will face from Russia and China. And in that, that's sort of where we can think about special forces, not just the literal things of what special forces can do, but in terms of being an element of supporting other states in their relations with Russia and China, and basically serving as this signal of supporting those states in their struggles. And that will help to complement and to add to the US deterrent effect. So, and that's also some of the things of which we can say, when we engage in this government-to-government relations, military-to-military relations, having those states recognize that the United States is behind them, thus makes it easier for those politicians in other countries to say to their own populations, whatever you see, there's other stuff that we are engaged with the Americans in order to, conduct our own, to the greatest extent possible, independent foreign policy. So I see that I'm out of time. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will turn it back over to Dr. Oakley.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Weber. Great presentation. Particularly liked your conversation or your discussion points on the difficulty of defining GPC and the importance of multiple audience, both domestic and international. So thank you very much. The next speaker is JSOU's own Dr. Dave Dudas, whose theme is towards a definition of strategic competition. Over to you, Dr. Dudas.
Thank you, Dr. Oakley, for moderating this panel. And I want to personally thank Dr. Wilson and General Howard for holding this important forum on strategic competition. And what a perfectly articulated scene center Dr. Wilson provided at the opening of the forum. And I believe a lot of discussion panels today are very complimentary of what Dr. Wilson laid out. As you noted, Dr. Oakley, I was asked to discuss what might make up the components of a working definition for strategic competition that would be beneficial to policymakers and policy managers across the USG for aligning activities in a manner that achieves unity of effort and purpose. But before we begin unpacking such a definition, I believe it's important to note that strategic competition is not unlike earlier histories as much as concerns over how to and with what resources and for what purposes continue to plague policymakers. Secretary of State Schultz during the Cold War said it best. The ironic fact is the new and elusive challenge has proliferated, in part because of our success in deterring nuclear and conventional war. Low-intensity war is a flanking maneuver. It exposed a chink in our armor. And much like the Cold War period, the chink in our armor today lies between the space of war and peace, what has been referred to as the gray zone, where competitive actions that take place between state and non-state actors are irregular in character. The challenge for policymakers then is to determine its nature and its character against the backdrop of broader assumptions regarding the appropriate ways and means to achieve policy ends. A definition that is capable of informing policymakers and managers from both a practical and normative sense. This is true of all government institutions, and particularly the Department of Defense, which is a prime stakeholder in the arena of competition, as well as our established allies that project power globally. U.S. defense policy makers must recognize the inherent tension between these imperatives, which is an outgrowth of our republic. Huntington said it best when he noted that the military institutions of any society are shaped by two competing forces: a functional imperative stemming from the threats to a state security, and a social imperative arising from the social forces, ideologies, and institutions dominant within that society. These competing forces often lead to faulty paradigms, where U.S. policymakers have become paradigm prisoners of their own making, having created a chasm between what is and what ought, a chasm between reality and ideals. In many ways, this has essentially led to an American way of thinking that has remained unchallenged and unchanged throughout the post-World War II period, despite the fact that it has not served the U.S. well in practice. I believe a new pragmatism must emerge regarding the challenge of the gray zone, where strategic competition takes place. Within military and civilian policymakers and the American body politique, there must grow an understanding of the nature and character of strategic competition and a recognition of the long-range threat that it poses. Without this new pragmatism, it is unlikely that the necessary national will, political resolve, and staying power can be developed to effectively respond to competitors such as China and Russia. First, U.S. policy managers and policymakers must understand that war and peace can no longer be defined in dichotomous terms. Traditionally, defense policymakers in particular think of the space between war and peace as an escalation of violence or a threat of violence. And this fundamentally leads us straight into the underlying analytic problem, that like war, strategic competition is political in nature. As Clausewitz noted, it's an extension of politics by other means. And even Clausewitz's definition of war, where he notes the act to compel another to one's will, he does not specifically limit it to the instrument of lethality and kinetic military force. Quite the contrary. Indeed, binary responses to war and peace are essentially anathema to strategic competition. It's characterized by greater ambiguity and requires a mindset that embraces irregularity as the norm and not the exception. Understanding that the gray zone activities will largely be political in nature and irregular in character, U.S. policymakers must recognize that legitimacy, the actions and activities the U.S. engages in at home and abroad, lies at the heart of it. Power will be more discrete and ambiguous, and it will manifest in ways that will challenge the legitimacy of competing powers across critical geographic and functional nexes. Therefore, actions competitors use to shape the strategic environment will be and are more nuanced and not necessarily based on latent or raw power alone. For instance, Russia is neutralizing American influence across certain regions by setting political conditions conducive to the emergence or maintenance of pro-Russian governments, especially in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Russia's theory of change is driven by a wide range of non-lethal and low-cost gray zone methods, including influence operations, information operations, manipulation of traditional and social media, economic coercion, covert support to domestic protest movements, cyber operations, and other tools of political warfare to weaken and destabilize the governments of U.S. allies and partners. China is using various ways and means as well, including debt trap diplomacy, infrastructure development, culture exchanges, etc., across the globe to achieve its Belt Road Initiative while simultaneously building out its military. The components of a definition, therefore, first and foremost, require U.S. policymakers to understand the nature and character of strategic competition, that it must include the concept of legitimacy as the driving force to winning in the gray zone. Influence is important, but not an end unto itself. Influence is the currency towards the bigger goal of legitimacy. Deterrence as a display of power will be necessary, but complementary efforts require the U.S. to move beyond long-standing and unchallenged paradigms and fully embrace the character of strategic competition as a game board that is largely characterized by irregular warfare. And such a definition must move beyond the platitudes and bumper sticker slogans such as whole of government, which is insufficient and does not capture the fidelity required for coordinating, integrating, and synchronizing across all stakeholders, including our allies and our partners. Building towards a definition, then, it must include concepts such as the pursuit of legitimacy through diplomatic, informational, military, and economic positions of advantage by and with our allies and partners to politically shape and regulate norms and rules globally. For China and Russia, this means undermining longstanding rules and norms and decision-making regimes that have governed the international system of states since Westphalia. What does this mean for SOF in particular? Well, first, I believe the U.S. policymakers' conceptions of SOF must move beyond the white versus black SOF dichotomies. Second, of the 9 mission sets that SOF conducts, it requires a meta-frame from which all mission sets flow. And as I've said several times, being the character of strategic competition, being that of irregular warfare, I believe the meta-frame should be irregular warfare. In addition, a large component of what SOF does in the context of competition will be through security cooperation. SOF has always been adept at maneuvering the spaces of far-off cultures, and today is no different than any of the preceding ages of SOF. If we agree then that legitimacy is the policy end in the gray zone where strategic competition takes place, then SOF is the currency that will bring about the return on investment to achieve broader policy ends. And to leverage the hard-earned gains of alliances and coalitions strategy and operations used during the global war on terrorism amongst like-minded nations reapplied in the context of strategic competition, SOF can play a major part in doing this in a way other services cannot and will not. Thank you again, Dr. Wilson and General Howard, for having me today, and back over to you, Dr. Oakley.
Hey, thanks, Dr. Dudas. Great discussion. Some of the points I want to really dive into during the Q&A is the legitimacy aspect of it. I think that's very important. Right now, we'll turn over to Mr. Bob Jones, who comes to us from SOCOM J5 Donovan Strategic Initiative Group. Over to you, Mr. Jones.
Okay. All right. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, so many doctors. I only bring a juris doctor to the table, but I think my secret weapon as a trial attorney was the ability to think like a Green Beret, and hopefully my secret weapon today will be able to think like a lawyer a little bit. But I'll start with some questions, and I'll answer those questions. And I think the first question that we all have to get our brain around is, what are we competing for? And my personal take is that what we're competing for is to maintain leadership of the rules-based system. And that should frame everything we do. Certainly China is competing to assume that role from us. And as we think about that competition, I think we need to realize that's not a role that one gives themselves. It is a role that is granted to someone by everybody else. So in that context, how is this competition framed? Are we competing against an actor like China for control? Or are we competing with an actor like China for influence? And I would argue we're competing with, and it is for influence. But what is influence? I think ultimately influence is being perceived as the partner of choice. We want, through our actions, not just our words. Our words can explain our actions, but our actions convey our message. But we need to be perceived by others as their best option for pursuing their own interest in the context of their own cultures with their own self-determined governance. All right, and we want to be the partner of choice because they're the one who are going to grant to us this writ of being the leader of the rules-based system, and they can take it away. And China need not defeat us to beat us. If the world loses faith in the United States, they'll just shift, and all of our military power will be left on the sidelines like the Maginot Line, unused and of little value to the true competition that's taking place. A couple of observations. I think the first observation that has struck me over the years is that there is this figurative great power playbook that's been passed down from great power to great power for 10,000 years. And that on our watch, I believe that playbook is fully obsolete. That no longer is it about how do we go out into the world to places where we perceive our interests to manifest and use our power to exercise control over those spaces and the populations that live there, either creating or adopting some government who we think will serve our interests, and then protecting that government against all comers, foreign and domestic. I believe that began to become obsolete during the last century as the great empire faded, as rising state powers and rising population powers led to 2 great wars and 3 tremendous eras of revolutionary turmoil, and that it's fully obsolete on our watch, and that we haven't made the adjustment yet. So certainly the shifts in the current era of technological change are far greater in speed, scope, scale of those of the industrial age. So this is creating challenges of state competition that cannot be contained. This is creating challenges of population competition that cannot be suppressed. Throw out the coin manual. That coin manual is all about colonial policing and how do you exercise control. We need to think about how do we exercise influence, and that's a completely different situation. And in that regard, I believe that in this game that we're playing with this new playbook, a new playbook that's focused on competition for influence, and that the game we're playing is one of strategic influence. And in that game, I believe the opportunity space is in populations who perceive themselves to be in conditions of legally irreconcilable political grievance. All right, and we see this domestically, we see this abroad. And this is a unique opportunity space for SOF. So we need to think about how do we make that shift? How do we reframe in our minds a new playbook where we are competing for influence? And how do we refocus ourselves from one of going after threats to try to suppress those symptoms of greater problems to one of competing positively to advance positive influence of the United States as partner of choice? And in the context of those actions, we then figure out well, who are the problematic actors and how do we work to disrupt, deter, suppress those actions, and how do we work to advance our own interests in that space? It frames a much more sophisticated competition than a reactive threat-focused one. Because ultimately, and when we think about these competition, it's that threats, by and large, are symptoms. They're symptoms of a larger problem, and to become overly fixated on any particular threat, any particular symptom, it risks devolving into a reactive strategy of tactics where we're constantly reacting to somebody else and what they're doing to advance their interests. It risks creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of competition as prelude to war, which is, I fear, kind of how the services think about competition. That's kind of the new phase zero, and that ultimately war is the end game. War is losing, even if we win. Okay, so we need to think about competition as peace. Okay, it's now, and this is a very different thing than a prelude to war, or how do I box out, some particular competitor. We got to think about how do we play our own game, because then we can define winning, and then we can frame our own actions in positive, proactive terms. I think the dangers outlined by George Washington in his farewell address are incredibly relevant to the world we live in today, and that if we divide the world into permanent allies and permanent enemies, we risk seeing threats from one and opportunities with the other, and it puts us really off of our foundation, of our principles that this nation was founded upon. And frankly, we've been off that foundation since 1949. And ironically, it was China that pushed us off the foundation then, because when nationalist Chinese were defeated and pushed to the island of Taiwan, we were no longer trying to contain Sovietism. We found ourselves trying to contain communism. Okay, well, how do you contain communism and allow self-determination when the populations of Southeast Asia reasonably saw communism as our pathway out of colonialism? It's a slippery slope, but we did what we had to do. We framed the problem as we understood it, and we competed to contain that threat, and ultimately that contest worked then. I would caution thinking that such an approach could work now, and that we should think about how do we get back on our foundation. Again, we are competing for influence with these groups, and they need to perceive their own self-determined governance. They need to perceive that their interests are being served by our leadership. On the slide, I talk about kind of three areas: the nature of man, the nature of nature, the nature of competition. Nature of man. Ultimately, we're talking about human endeavors, and I believe human endeavors are framed by human nature, and the really good strategic work, guys like Thucydides, Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, they really focused on human nature to create a framework, and that's very helpful for thinking about war. But do we have a good framework for thinking about peace and peace-based competition or population-based competition like revolution? I don't think we do. I think we try to apply a war framework to peace problems, and it worked when you could suppress, but it doesn't work when you have to influence. So we need to rethink this, because ultimately the important aspects of human nature give us a framework to think about situations. Nature of nature. I don't know what's causing it, but we know that the climate is changing. We know that ice in the Arctic is melting. The great geostrategic theorists, Mahan, Mackinder, Speakman, that stuff's all valid. Mackinder argued for the heartland approach, but that never really manifested because no country had the infrastructure to make it work. Speakman's rimland approach with the southern routes, and whoever controlled those sea lanes controlled commerce, and they led the rules-based system. It was simple. But the northern sea route is nearly half the distance of the southern route through the Suez Canal and Malacca Straits. If that route opens, we will have been outflanked by nature, okay? And the competition will have shifted north, and China's already preparing their heartland infrastructure with Belt and Road. They're looking to partnerships to the north with Russia to take advantage of this new opportunities. And we will find ourselves an island. And if the markets of Asia and Europe are connected by a Chinese system, that's a strong card for them to play in an argument for why they should lead the rules-based system as we sit on our island. isolated from that larger connected market space. Lastly, in this competition, we just need to appreciate that ultimately with state actors, as a nation's power rises, they will seek naturally to bring their sovereign privilege in line with their power. China's sovereign privilege was defined for them by others 70 years ago, and they naturally seek to expand their sovereign privilege to be more in line with their existing power as they are today. Doesn't mean we give it to them, doesn't mean we allow them what they want, but we need to figure out what do we need to hold on to, what can we divest of, how do we become a more sophisticated leader who delegates roles more effectively with our partners and allies and brings more people into the tent, okay, to work with us, as opposed to framing them as someone that we can only work against. And again, lastly, we live in revolutionary times. Populations everywhere are pushing back on what they perceive as inappropriate foreign presence, foreign policies. Populations everywhere are pushing back against governance that they perceive as out of touch with their evolving expectations as a population. This is rich competition space for SOF. And understanding instability, understanding stability, understanding how to leverage these things with more fundamental perspectives on the powerful, powerful tool of unconventional warfare. And recognize it's not about parachuting into France in World War II to work with the underground. It's about leveraging the insurgent energy and populations governed by others in order to advance our own interests. And through that vehicle, we have powerful opportunities to foster influence, foster stability, and leverage instability to create new deterrent effects that work below the threshold of traditional deterrence. All right, and thank you, and I'll turn it back over to you, Dave.
Hey, thanks, Bob. Hey, great presentation. The thing I'm always nervous whenever you do a panel is that you'll have, multiple directions of themes and they never really come together. But these three panelists, I think, did a great job, identified some of the similar themes, but from different perspectives, themes like difficulty in defining great power competition, the importance of education, looking towards history, looking towards theory to underpin our understanding. And so great job. What I'd like to do is I'd like to begin with a question to all three panelists, and I'll ask Dr. Weber to go first, followed by Dr. Dudas, and then Mr. Jones. But, I see the purpose of PME is to, nurture practitioners, certain attributes within practitioners, such as critical thinking or certain skills, just like the ability to conduct research to understand an operational environment. And then also kind of to instill a desire, a want, an appreciation of how scholarship can enable the practitioner. Each of your presentations highlight the value of education. They're all rich in theory and reference numerous scholars, for the practitioner. So for example, Dr. Weber, not only did you identify the value of history and appreciating the present, but you mentioned international relations concepts such as anarchy and audience costs and how to create costs on our competitor within their domestic environment. Dr. Dudas, your presentation highlighted the importance of theory and how we frame the environment, your dichotomy of war and peace specifically. And you seem to take a multidisciplinary approach in generating your understanding of the environment. I heard Clausewitz, Huntington, and there was even some Reinhold Niebuhr, accept the world for what it is, not what you wish it to be, thrown in there. And then finally, Mr. Jones, your comment, knowledge is both the pathway and the obstacle to understanding. I believe it highlights, both the need for education to understand the environment, but also acknowledges the limits of understanding. Two realities I believe education helps us appreciate. It widens our knowledge, but it also kind of humbles us. I also heard themes within your talk about audience costs and how to influence other audiences and to create maybe some domestic audience costs in our competitors. This leads me to my question. Can each of you comment on the role of education and the importance of engaging with scholarship for the SOF practitioner to appreciate the environment and take purposeful action within the current strategic landscape, that being compounded security environment?
So thank you, Dr. Oakley. Great question. So when thinking about history and thinking about, international relations theory, like basically what's the value of these things? At its core, what we can think about in terms of PME is getting people comfortable with the very idea of uncertainty. The entire sort of construct of like, what is international relations theory? Like, what is it that I do for a living? I study different things on how states, individuals, transnational organizations, how do they deal with uncertainty? How do they mitigate the risks that the lack of world government poses to them? And how do they take advantage of that? So if you then sort of boil it all down to, we had previous comments, particularly from Mr. Jones regarding Mr. Work on effectively like what is influence? Influence is just the opportunity to do something that you may not be physically able to do in that moment. So the more that basically the soft practitioners think, how can we identify opportunities and then take advantage, insert ourselves into something in order to make future opportunities more available to us? That's, I think, the core thing of what we can do in terms of PME, to just identify these arbitrage opportunities within international politics in order to make US influence more rather than less likely. And that's essentially what the study of history, and particularly the study of international relations theory, can do, is basically act as these flashlights or these magnifying glasses to understand what are the claims that we can make, that we can fulfill, and what are the claims that other great powers can make that they can't fulfill and that we can point to and take advantage of that. And I think once you start to put these things in order, we can then see how is it that our claims of we'll do this for you, third party state, is more rather than less credible. Thanks.
Yeah, Dr. Oakley, I think for me, first and foremost, there's got to be a balance between training and education. I believe we do an exceptional job training our soft, but not necessarily educating them. That doesn't mean that they're uneducated. By no means am I saying that, but within the context of giving them the opportunity to get advanced degrees, are in most cases very limited to soft, and in most cases much later in their life cycle of training. I believe we need to build strategic practitioners at a much early level with multiple touch points along the way. And also I think we need to give, because soft is a low density, high demand capability, we have to think of innovative ways to get them into the classroom to study theory and history. And this is coupled with their standard PME requirements. But I believe to build, a pentathlete for what this nation needs in the context of compound security threats and within competition, we have to challenge paradigms. We have to challenge the way we think about the space between war and peace. And I think to do that, you got to get the soft practitioners into the classroom, and we have to find ways through various concepts. And I know Dr. Wilson is looking at this really hard in terms of how to build out, a specific learning models that will enable, our soft practitioners to get into the classroom, whether if it be through distant learning or otherwise. So I'm glad that we're taking those steps, but it's definitely needed.
Okay. Well, in my own experience, like when I went to law school, my school that I attended, they were very focused on, we're not going to teach you the bar exam. We're not going to teach you how to conduct a trial. We're going to teach you how to think like a lawyer. So this focus on educating people on how to think more than what to know. Now that wasn't particularly helpful when I sat down for the bar exam, and it wasn't particularly helpful the first time I stepped into a courtroom. But over time, it's been tremendously helpful in both of those experiences and everything I've done since. And what I fear, what I see happening in this era of tremendous change, when all of our senior leaders throughout government grew up being successful in waging a Cold War competition, being successful in 20 years of counterterrorism type activities as we have defined success in those contests, we're dealing with a very different paradigm that's fully manifested before us. And my concern is that we may well define our way to failure, but we need to understand our way to success. And this means that People need to turn loose of what they are comfortable with. People need to be comfortable with the saying, like, you know what? I was very successful as commander in this year to this year in this particular battle space, doing what I was asked to do by my policy leaders. But I need to be comfortable with saying, you know what? Policy was probably poorly formed based on how we understood the world historically and not really appropriate to how the world's operating now. The tactics and approaches we took were appropriate to what we were asked to do and how we understood the problem, but probably weren't the best things to actually best serve our strategic interests. And be willing to open your mind and be humble and saying, okay, we did what we did. Now we're here. It's like General Cato on D-Day Beach. He's a mile from where he was supposed to be, but here you are. And there's only one direction to go, and that's forward. And so we start from here. Let's open our minds and train, teach our guys to think and challenge and question and not suppress that. Thank you.
Hey, thank all three of you. It seems to me, listening to your discussion, and I would agree with the point, is that the military, we've cornered the market. We're very successful in creating technicians, individuals who understand how to deploy combat power or project power. But I don't know if we educate well enough to really get them to appreciate what occurs once they enter the environment. And, many of you guys brought up, I think, specifically Bob and Yuval brought up the concept of risk. And, to me, I don't see how our practitioners can understand risk unless we move to kind of an educated practitioner away from the technician to understand what risk they might create once they step into that environment. And so very great points. I'm going to ask my second question to Dr. Dave Dudas. You mentioned the rethinking the notion of power. So back to an international relations concept. And then, specifically who holds power. And the way you described it, I was thinking of a concept of power over, power to compel, to force, and then power to make your own kind of decisions and choices. And so, speaking from that, power might not just be in the hands of one. And so along that line of thinking, in your view, is strategic competition, is it a zero-sum power game?
Dave, Dr. Oakley, that question is for me or for Dr. Yuval or for Dr. Jones?
I intended for you, but I open the floor to whoever has a perspective.
No, that's another great question. I don't necessarily see it as zero sum, but what we have to do is, I think we have to account for instance, you think about the actions. I'll use China as an example, and as an example globally. What they are doing in a number of countries at these strategic, geographic, and functional nexes is, it's not just a debt trap diplomacy, but they're helping build infrastructure. They're building libraries out in the middle of the desert in Djibouti, for instance, where in a very poor section of the town. And what they're doing essentially is they're trying to gain, to some degree, local population favor. But at the same time, if you look at their elite, I consider them and how they approach their strategy is from basically an elite-based model approach, where they primarily directly work with the governments themselves. And in many cases, they're bringing their own, Chinese nationalists to do the construction and do all the work, and rarely hire the local population. Whereas, the U.S., you think about some of the things that we've been doing, whether it be using ODACA funds or otherwise, but how we do purchase things on the local population, how we do engage the local population wherever we may be based abroad. I think this is important. I think this is important because, it was once said that winning, so for instance, winning in irregular warfare, it requires it to be 99% indigenous, right? That's how you gain legitimacy, by the forces on the ground, the people on the ground, doing the hard work. right, of governance and development and security. But from a soft practitioner perspective and from an educational perspective is really, I think, important to recognize that what soft in particular does at that first 3 feet and their engagement, how they build relationships, how they build trust. As I had noted, they're so culturally adept at being able to maneuver in that space. You know, there are so many cases out there where even when the roads got very bumpy in the strategic relationships, if you go back and look really hard, you'll find that SOF was at the heart of maintaining because they had such strong relationships with the military. And I'm not just saying it's just SOF alone, but it's those mill-to-mill relationships that really get us through, in many cases, those bumpy times. And so I think power, we have to really reconsider power in those ways. It's just, and how it kind of funnels into legitimacy, because it's not about necessarily U.S. legitimacy in terms of what it does, what it's doing to win the hearts and minds, so to speak, within these countries. But it's legitimacy in terms of how are we portraying ourselves both at home? How are we portraying ourselves abroad? And I think if we're willing to play the long game, we're going to get greater return on investment. It's those smaller things that we do, I think, over time that really, if you want to equate that to power, I think it is really those smaller things that we do. And I think, again, once that's off is, you know, there are military ambassadors and they're incredibly important, especially in the space of strategic competition.
Hey, thanks, Dr. Dudas. Was there any other thoughts from the panels on the concept of power?
So if I may just a quick comment there, I'd really like to echo and sort of amplify what Dr. Duda said, that in essence, how to engage the local population, the risk and uncertainty in international politics is just a given. It just always exists. So what can be done in essence to take advantage of it or to mitigate the risks from it? And I think particularly when we're thinking about an example such as China building a library somewhere in the middle of Djibouti, which, by the way, is lovely. Libraries are great. But if we keep chasing libraries in Djibouti, that means that China is deciding how, when, and where the United States is applying, you know, its money, its influence, its energy. So part of, I think, what we can do in thinking about the great power competition, creating influence, generating this legitimacy, is what is the first-rate version of us that basically is on offer to the rest of the world, rather than trying to be a second-rate anybody else. And I think that is the sort of thing that when the crisis comes, if people believe this is the best version of America, this is the version of America that we believe is sustainable, that's going to be a lot more valuable than they were only here because the Chinese were interested. Copy.
Yeah, hey, just again, just to tag on to those great thoughts. You know, when we think about power, it's not how much power do you have. It's do you got the right type of power, and are you applying it for the right purpose? When we look to influence, as I think the coin of the realm in competition, we've been trading airspeed for altitude since 1949. That was probably, you know, I think of peak oil. I think peak influence for the United States was 1949. We just completed the Berlin airlift. We created NATO. John Wayne started as Sergeant Stryker in the sands of Iwo Jima. I mean, this is how we saw ourselves and how the world saw us. And in that same year, Mao prevailed over the nationalist Chinese, and the Soviets detonated their first nuclear device, and the world changed. And we found ourselves in a competition where we had to compromise much of ourselves in order to do what we thought we had to do to win that contest. As I think about the old coin phrase, hearts and minds, I put a modern spin on that. I think in this competition for strategic influence, that hearts and minds is being near to the hearts of those who would work with us and inside the minds of those who'd work against us. And that's great competition space for SOF.
No, great points about power. You know, you guys have me thinking, you know, it seems to me that power is not zero sum. And if you even think about, you know, the countries that we are competing for influence over. They have a certain level of power. They have power to choose which side or not to choose which side. So I think your nuanced discussion of power is important for planners and practitioners to think of, soft professionals. Real quick, before I move on to a question from the audience. So for the audience, the chat function that you ask questions, you put your questions into went down. And so you need to refresh your browser and the chat should start again, and then you'll be able to ask any of the questions you have. So the first question from the audience, and although I'm gonna open up the floor for this question, I like to start with Mr. Jones, because I think it's something that you touched upon in your presentation. Question is, can we be partner of choice for everyone? We are very selective in the countries we engage. How do we become the partner of choice for critical security nations? And when you discuss that, also, if you could add on that, the importance of maybe allies in spreading the partnerships.
Absolutely. Okay. So great question. I think the first thing is, traditionally great powers kind of apply an arbitrator mindset when they go out to exercise their power to secure their interests, where an arbitrator makes decisions and enforces those decisions. Okay. That's the old playbook. I think we need to think more like a mediator, and not be the mediator, but think like a mediator. A mediator uses his power and influence to create a table that everybody can sit around and forces them to hammer out the problematic issues that are at hand. So it's not, how do we secure some particular government in power against the express opposition of their own population in some corner of the planet where we've done so for a long time because we have economic interests, geostrategic interests, or we just have a commitment to this particular country over the years. We need to have a fresh conversation and realize that those types of approaches create the resistance energy and populations that Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Iran rely upon for their sophisticated unconventional warfare campaigns that they've tortured us with over the last 20 years. Okay. We need to take the energy out of the system. So we need to have new conversations, and we need to be much more pragmatic as we sit down with important partners and allies and basically say, hey, I love you like a brother, but we're not going to take our airplanes and our buildings flown by your insurgents because we can't see how to get to a more sophisticated relationship that's more relevant to the world we live in today, as opposed to the world we lived in when FDR struck a deal with Ibn Saud in 1944. Okay, the world has changed, and we must change in our relationships. We must change in our approach to how we advance our interests. And it starts with being more pragmatic, and it starts with being more open-minded, less judgmental, less trying to make others a smaller version of us, and more about how to help them be the best version of their own selves. Okay, and recognize that we need to not be jealous either. In this competition, important allies and partners are gonna want an economic relationship with China, but they're gonna need a security relationship with the United States. Okay, and that's okay, right? We just got to be there, and people need to know that we're not the guys that are gonna take advantage of them. To go back to that Ibn Saud conversation with FDR, because to me there was a couple very critical insights. He said, hey, look, one, we need a security partner. Many of our partners and allies also need security partners today. Two, he said, we perceive that the United States is far less likely to be overly manipulative of our internal interactions as a country than the European countries have proven to be, in the earlier times. Okay, we've kind of drifted from that. We need to get back on track of being perceived as that country that's not going to overly manipulate you. And the last and most critical is, and besides, you're so very far away. And that's never going to change. The nations of the Pacific, Indo-Pacific region, they're going to have strong economic relationships with China. That's natural, but they're also fearful that China's going to abuse those relationships, and they need a distant security partner they can trust. And we need to build on that. Over.
Hey, thanks, Bob. A follow-on to that question I'd like to toss out there, and I think it gets to one of the points of a question that came in from the audience. But it seems to me that we think of this great power competition oftentimes as us versus them. And I know, Bob, specifically, you highlighted the danger in that. As I think about, partners and allies and U.S. overreach, I guess, it seems to me that if you look, and we'll use Indo-Pacific, for example, if you look at some of the Pacific Island nations, they already have strong relationships with countries like Australia. And so, my question is the importance or the necessity to ensure that you don't have overreach about using our allies and our, not thinking it's just us versus them, but bringing allies and relying on allies to strengthen the relationships with these, other nations. So it doesn't always have to be the U.S. Being the, competing for the preferred choice. I'll begin with Dr. Dudas. I don't know if you have any comments on.
Yeah, I do. I think Mr. Jones' points are spot on, and we do absolutely have to be more pragmatic, as that was one of the touch points I made in my talk. But I think, especially in the Indo-PACOM region, we have to rely on our allies more, and we cannot be everywhere. We have finite resources. That's just a reality, as does everyone. Even, China doesn't have unlimited resources. So, you give, for instance, a place like Thailand, where the U.S. has traditionally had a very strong relationship going back to the 50s and to this very day. And actually, we have gotten through some very bumpy periods through multiple coups that have taken place. But in that case, maybe it is the U.S. that's the lead. But if you go to a place like, for instance, Oceania, maybe it's the Aussies, maybe it's the New Zealanders, maybe it's one of our close allies or partners that actually is taking lead, and we are in a more supporting role in that regard, because it's not just all about the U.S. and how we compete alone. Obviously, we cannot do it alone. So I think it's important that, a first principle has to be getting back to those traditional alliances and those partnerships that we've had for a considerable amount of decades and perhaps longer. And build off of those. And Mr. Jones is absolutely right. A lot of these countries are very concerned. They understand that China's in their backyard. They certainly don't want to do anything to upset China. Many times they don't necessarily want to choose partners, because we get to that one question about, well, can the U.S. be everybody's preferred partner or partner of choice? Probably not, because there's going to be partners too that are going to probably play the fence, right? They're going to sit on the fence, or they're going to play both sides to some degree, because they want to get the most out of both relationships. And so they're being very pragmatic about it. But again, I think we have to get back to really relying more on our traditional alliances and those partnerships that we've had for a long time. And I think those in themselves are going to help us get greater return on investment in the long run.
Let me just throw out there very quickly. China's number one trading partner is the United States. So in a general sense, nobody likes to be on the receiving end of a take it or leave it offer. So I think, to echo what Mr. Jones, Dr. Dudas has said, is it would be, I think, a lot more effective to say we have a tremendous economic relationship with China. We have many political and security differences with them. So here are the steps that we're taking to mitigate those risks and that uncertainty to us. If you want to do the same thing, we're happy to help. If you have other things that you need to do for your own purposes, that's okay too. But here's what we're doing. And that's essentially where we can, I think that's a more effective pitch.
Yeah, and just a final thought, I guess. I kind of joke about this, but I think everyone will hear the truth in what I say. When it comes to leadership, we often lead like the worst second lieutenant in the battalion. All right. We go around telling everybody we're in charge. We make up rules that we're either unable or unwilling to enforce or follow ourselves. We don't listen very well to those with far more experience but less rank. We host mandatory fun events and demand that everybody comes. Okay, and we don't delegate. So I would challenge the United States to be a more sophisticated leader. Stop being that guy. be that other guy. Be that guy who is the leader that everybody wants to follow. Okay, not because they're curious about what you're going to screw up, but because they want to be there, you know, and because whatever you're going to be doing is something they want a part of.
Hey, thanks. You know, some great points, and it actually dovetails really great into a question from the audience. And so, you know, you mentioned Bob often leading like the worst second lieutenant, and then Yuval, you kind of highlighted this us or them, and so the Dave mentality that sometimes does not serve us well. And so the question from the audience is, considering that, have we already lost the influence battle for New Zealand as they consider leaving Five Eye due to Chinese influence? Doesn't the U.S. have more economic and other dying power, influential potential towards New Zealand than China? I didn't know if any one of you guys want to tackle that, if you're familiar with the New Zealand Five Eye issue.
Well, let me just throw this in there for those who've been following the news, right? The COVID is exposed some of the kind of dirty underbelly of Chinese influence. Certainly the Australians are pushing back hard. Just yesterday, the Philippine government pushed back very hard, and the guy basically told the Chinese to F off, which in Asia, you know, is pretty hard talk. So we're seeing pushback. Yeah, New Zealand's been pretty cozy, but I think the bloom is off the rose, and everybody is realizing that free is rarely a good deal. And so this is creating an opportunity, right? This is creating an opportunity for us to reframe ourselves and come back in, be that security partner, but also, you know, back off on some of these worst second lieutenant aspects of our leadership and start being more sophisticated in our leadership. I see promise in how President Biden is framing the competition, and I think we in the military need to be prepared to figure out, well, what does that mean for us, and how do we help them in that?
Hey, thanks, Bob. So another question, and this ties to the point of legitimacy that Dr. Dudas mentioned, and then I believe it also touches on some of the audience cost. But it's how we're viewed not only in the eyes of internationally based on our foreign policy choices, but also how we're viewed domestically, and then how it affects our legitimacy in those two populations' eyes. So the question is, can we succeed in competition without principle? Historically, we have supported governmental and cultural aspirations antithetical to our principles. The Shah of Iran, military dictatorship in Latin America, monarchy in the Gulf, cultural suppression of women's rights. Dr. Dudas, I was hoping you could start off with that, considering the legitimacy aspect of it.
Yeah, Dr. Oakley. So what I'm hearing the question be with regard to some of our relationships overseas that, you know, in many cases, you know, we're necessitated by the functional imperative, right? The threats that had evolved, and even during the period post 9/11, for instance, we could use our relationship with Egypt as a great example. But certainly Egypt has been a bulwark in many cases against the threats, you know, shared interests that we have. But I think there's a careful balance, but I think we do have to be pragmatic about things when it comes to security, and building legitimacy is certainly, you know, it's a combination, as I noted, right? It's our principles, it's our values at home. I believe we should be unapologetic. And I think the one thing that we failed to do is we are not very good from a strategic communication perspective of saying just exactly what a republic is. There's a multiplicity of voices coming from our nation, and there's different ideas of how we should be governed, but it's all welcomed. There are certainly challenges that we face, certainly today in our current context, that I think, you know, maybe raising the eyebrows of allies and partners alike abroad. But I think we have to be a little bit more explicit about what the republic actually is, what it is that the United States represents. And of course, we're not perfect. It's towards a greater union, right? So I would just keep those things in mind. And when we engage with partners, for instance, a country like Thailand, where the coup was conducted, I think, 2014, and they didn't have elections until I think March of 2019. So there was a long period where the U.S. and from the security assistance perspective, we shut down IMET to a large extent in foreign military financing. But I think we maintained a security cooperation relationship. We shifted our focus a little bit, but I think you still have to maintain those relationships with those critical partners, like a Thailand, like in Egypt. It's not to say that we are turning a blind eye to what's happening in those nations. But I think if we withdraw completely, then we're just opening up the door for Russia. We're just opening up the door for a China, for them to help push forward and bolster perhaps those governments. So I think we need to stay engaged in those periods.
Hey, thanks, Dr. Dudas. Unfortunately, we're getting the hook, so we ran out of time. But I want to thank the three panelists for outstanding presentations, getting us to think about what is great power competition, the importance of knowing history and scholarship to understand great power competition, and then hopefully take purposeful action. So thank you very much. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to General Howard.
What a great first panel. Thank you, Dr. Oakley, for such a great job, and to all three of our presenters.